unreeled. Vintage recordings of fiction recovered from discontinued physical media.
The Merchant of Venice. Shakespeare probably wrote The Merchant of Venice in 1596, taking the plot from an Italian story. It is a comedy, but a strangely dark one. The story is set in Venice, the Italian city that grew wealthy through trade. Buying and selling at a profit or loss was the city's lifeblood. Doing the business deals were merchants, who put their money at risk in the hope of making a lot more money. Money is central to the play. Lack of it, love of it, the power of it. There is another theme, too, that of the outsider in a community. Today, the hatred we see displayed by Shakespeare's characters is called racism. The object of this racism is Shylock, a moneylender and Jew who lives in a community of Christians. At the time when the tale was set, lending money at interest was frowned on by both church and state. Shylock complains that only by this means can he live. He is not allowed to trade. But moneylenders are rarely liked, even though business could not exist without them. Shylock is not a likeable person. He is miserly. His servant, a comic figure called Lancelot Gobbo, cannot wait to desert him. His much-loved daughter deserts him too, leaving home with money and jewels when she runs away to marry the Christian, Lorenzo. The loss of his daughter and his money fills Shylock with hatred and rage. It is one more insult from the Christian community that despises him. He aches for revenge. Lorenzo's friend, Bassanio, also has marriage plans, but no money to pursue them. His love is the rich heiress Portia, and in order to woo her, he asks his merchant friend Antonio for a loan. Antonio's money is tied up in overseas ventures. He has no spare cash, so the two go to Shylock. In the past, Antonio has reviled Shylock for charging interest on loans. Shylock claims that Antonio, who lends money without charge, threatens his livelihood. He agrees to the loan, however, but on unusual terms. If the debt is not paid on time, Shylock will claim a pound of Antonio's flesh. The deal is laughable, but it is made, albeit with some misgivings on Bassanio's part. Bassanio goes to Belmont, Portia's home. There, to win his bride, he must choose correctly one of 3 caskets, of gold, silver and lead. Bassanio is successful. He marries Portia, and his friend Gratiano marries Nerissa, Portia's lady-in-waiting. But news now comes that Antonio's ships have been lost. He cannot repay the debt. Shylock claims his pound of flesh. The case goes to court, where Portia appears in disguise as a lawyer. Bassanio offers 3 times the money owed if Shylock will tear up the agreement. For Shylock, money is not enough. He wants his due and justice. Portia asks him to show mercy, but he will not. She then points out that should Shylock take more than an exact pound of flesh, or spill a drop of blood, he too must die, for murder. Shylock's case collapses. He must surrender his money and become a Christian. To understand why Shylock acts as he does, we have to think of the times in which Shakespeare was writing. Jews were a minority group, often the target for prejudice. At best, they were tolerated but shunned. At worst, they were persecuted. Today, we see Shylock as a tragic and sympathetic figure despite his cruelty and greed. These are human failings, not racial ones, and we may well question the motives and actions of other Christian characters in the play. An Elizabethan audience might have felt differently. Another playwright might have made Shylock a figure of fun or hatred. Shakespeare gives him human dignity, and for all but the Jew, there is a happy ending.
The Merchant of Venice. In the watery city of Venice, where high-necked boats like children's painted horses nod and curtsy along the flowing streets, and the bright air is full of the winks and chinks of smiling money, there lived a merchant by the name of Antonio. He was as good and upright a man as ever merchant was, and all his wealth was laid out in tall, billowing vessels that ventured for trade far and wide. He had everything a merchant might have wished for, but he was melancholy, and knew not why. It was as if there was a shadow over the sun, cooling his pleasures and darkening his days. As he strolled along the busy Rialto, where rich men gathered in their velvet caps and brocaded gowns and talked of affairs, two friends tried to discover the cause of his sadness, and so cure it. Was he troubled about the safety of his vessels? Or was he in love, which was a mournful business if ever there was one? He shook his head. As they walked, they were joined by three young men, dressed in the height of silken fashion. Their names were Bassanio, Lorenzo, and Graziano, and at first sight there seemed little else to choose between them. They were three young men with nothing better to do than to stroll and talk and laugh and enjoy being young. "You look not well, Signor Antonio," observed Graziano, who was the liveliest of the three. "You have too much respect upon the world." The merchant disclaimed, and Graziano rattled on, 19 to the dozen, if not 20, until even he became wearied of his own chatter. Linking arms with Lorenzo, he drifted away after the others, who had already gone. The merchant and Bassanio were left alone. "Graziano speaks an infinite deal of nothing," said Bassanio, falling into seriousness as if out of respect for his companion's grave looks. Antonio smiled. He was deeply fond of Bassanio, and looked upon him almost as a son. It often happens with older men, whose sober lives aligned and straightened in with affairs of business, that they look fondly on the happy carelessness of youth, as they might take pleasure in the springtime's birds. There was a lady that Bassanio had talked of, and had promised to speak of again. Antonio inquired about her, but Bassanio shook his head. He carried too heavy a cargo of present troubles to spread his sails for love. He had spent all his rich inheritance, and was drowning in a sea of debts. "To you, Antonio," he confessed, "I owe the most in money and in love." Antonio bade him not think of it. It grieved the good merchant to see the carefree young man grow grey and pinched for the want of so mean a thing as money. "My purse, my person," he offered impulsively. "My extremest means lie all unlocked to your occasions." Bassanio needed no more invitation. If but Antonio would lend him what he needed for a certain enterprise, then Bassanio was confident all would be repaid. The merchant smiled at the young man's enthusiasm, and asked what the certain enterprise might be. Bassanio hesitated, and sighed. "In Belmont," said he, with an ardent look, "is a lady richly left." Not only was this lady as lovely as she was rich, but she was jewelled with every virtue, and suitors came from far and wide to gain her heart and hand. "Her name is Portia," said Bassanio, as if in that name was enshrined all the beauty of the world. He had seen her once, and had received such encouragement from her eyes that he was sure he would succeed in winning her. That is, if only he had the money to present himself before her as a suitor of equal worth among his rivals. Antonio nodded. Maybe it was not an enterprise that a sober merchant would have embarked upon, but it seemed proper for a youth like Bassanio, who was made not for trade, but for love. "Thou knowest," he began, "that all my fortunes are at sea. Neither have I money nor commodity to raise a present sum." Here Bassanio began to look dismayed. Antonio continued, "Therefore go forth, try what my credit can in Venice do. Go presently inquire, and so will I, where money is." Bassanio beamed. His eyes shone with tears of gratitude. Antonio was his good angel. He shook him warmly by the hand, and sped away to find some worthy man from whom he might borrow money against Antonio's good name. Antonio gazed affectionately after him as he hastened, like a bright dream, among the sombrely robed men of business who thronged the Rialto. Presently he was gone, and the merchant's strange melancholy returned. Far across the sea, in Belmont, the Lady Portia's palace was besieged by sighs. Suitors drooped and languished, sad as urn draperies, in her doorways, in her gardens, in her stables, and in her wine vaults. "By my troth, Nerissa," she confided to her maid, being weighed down by all this forlorn furniture, and shadowed by a strange condition laid upon her by her dead father, that she should never choose a husband, but must instead be chosen. "My little body is aweary of this great world." Portia's hair was fair as sunshine, and her countenance was fairer still. In stature she was, perhaps, a finger's breadth below the middle height, but such was the grace of her form that beside her those of the middle height seemed too tall. Whoever gained her love would never want for sunny days, nor a dearer summer than hers. Yet this fair lady could only be won by lottery. By her dying father's decree, her fate was locked in one of 3 caskets, of gold, of silver, and of lead. One choice was allowed each suitor. If he chose wrongly, that was the end of his hopes. "What warmth is there in your affection towards any one of these princely suitors that are already come?" asked Nerissa, curious to learn if her mistress's heart inclined any one way more than another. "I pray thee overname them," said Portia with a yawn. "First there is the Neapolitan prince." The lady wrinkled her nose. "Oh, he does nothing but talk of his horse, and he makes it a great appropriation to his own good parts that he can shoe him himself. I am much afeard my lady his mother played false with a smith." Nerissa laughed. "Then there is the County Palatine." "Oh, he does nothing but frown," complained Portia. "He hears merry tales and smiles not. I'd rather be married to a death's head with a bone in his mouth." Nerissa agreed with her young mistress. Belmont was a house of smiles. "How say you by the French lord Monsieur Le Bon?" "God made him," pronounced Portia, "and therefore let him pass for a man." Nothing more, it seemed, could be said in favour of Monsieur Le Bon. "What say you then to Falconbridge, the young Baron of England?" "You know I say nothing to him, for he understands not me, nor I him. Alas, who can converse with a dumb show?" The other suitors fared no better in Portia's esteem. There was a Scottish lord who did nothing but quarrel and brawl, and a German duke who did nothing but drink. "I will do anything, Nerissa," wailed Portia, quite overcome by the thought of the wine-swilling duke, "ere I will be married to a sponge." But Portia's fears proved groundless. Her present crop of suitors were departing, and there was none who cared to risk his fortune on the lottery of the caskets. "Do you not remember, lady," said Nerissa suddenly, "in your father's time, a Venetian, a scholar and a soldier, that came hither in company of the Marquis of Montferrat?" Portia frowned. Then her eyes gleamed brightly. Yes, it was Bassanio, as I think so he was called. True, madam, he of all the men that ever my foolish eyes looked upon was the best deserving a fair lady." "I remember him well," murmured Portia, smiling to herself, "and I remember him worthy of thy praise." In Venice, Bassanio had laid his hands on money. He had found a man who might be willing to lend him money against the word and bond of his friend Antonio. In a narrow street, where the water ran dark and crooked between high weeping walls, and little barred windows like imprisoned eyes stared dully down, he had met with a lean, bearded man in black, who smiled and frowned and smiled and frowned, and rubbed his hands together as if he would get to the bone of them. Shylock was his name, and he was a Jew. He was not a man to Bassanio's liking, nor to the liking of any Venetian, for he seemed to crawl across the fair fabric of the city like a spider, spoiling it. But he lent money. 3,000 ducats, well, mused the Jew, rubbing his hands and frowning in his beard. "Aye, sir, for 3 months. urged Bassanio, hovering brightly in attendance on the dark, ugly Jew. 3,000 ducats for 3 months, and Antonio bound, brooded the Jew, beginning to pace back and forth with such nervous rapidity that Bassanio was hard put to keep up with him. Shylock was doubtful. He allowed that Antonio was a good man, meaning that the merchant's credit was good, that being the only way by which a merchant's goodness was to be measured. But all his wealth was laid out in ships at sea, and as the Jew put it, ships are but boards, sailors but men. There is the peril of waters, winds, and rocks. He shook his head, and poor Bassanio looked dismayed. He sighed, and Bassanio's heart dropped fathoms deep. Then he chuckled, and Bassanio walked on air. 3,000 ducats, said the Jew most cheerfully. I think I may take his bond. May I speak with Antonio? If it please you to dine with us, offered Bassanio eagerly. The Jew took a pace back. He stared at Bassanio as if he was mad. Yes, to smell pork, he answered savagely. I will buy with you, sell with you, talk with you, walk with you, and so following, but I will not eat with you, drink with you, nor pray with you. A figure approached. This is Signor Antonio, said Bassanio quickly. He was fearful that he might have unwittingly offended the lender of money. With an anxious watch upon the Jew, lest he lose him, the young man went a few paces to meet the merchant, who was plainly pleased to have found his friend. Shylock, shrinking back against the wall till he seemed no more than an ugly stain upon it, stared at the merchant. How like a fawning publican he looks, he snarled into his beard. I hate him, for he is a Christian. Nor was this the only reason for the Jew's hate. The merchant lent money without interest, and so brought down the cost of borrowing in Venice. Money was the Jew's only commodity, and the Christian undermined him. The Christian could make money out of trade. The Jew, by Venetian law, could only make money out of money. Take away his money, and you take away his life. For these reasons, the dark Jew hated the bright Christians of Venice, and, strongest of all, he hated them because they hated him. Hate breeds hate as fast as summer flies. But nothing of this hatred showed as he greeted the merchant with smiles and bows and outstretched palms. All was satin courtesy. Antonio, on the other hand, regarded the cringing Jew with unconcealed contempt. He loathed and despised the Jew, and, had it not been for the purpose of supplying the need of his young friend, who looked anxiously from one to the other, he would have scorned to walk upon the same side of the street as Shylock. 3,000 ducats, said Shylock. 'Tis a good round sum. 3 months from 12. Then let me see the rate. Well, Shylock, demanded the merchant coldly, shall we be beholding to you? The Jew smiled humbly and sighed. Signor Antonio, many a time and oft in the Rialto you have rated me about my moneys and my usances. Still have I borne it with a patient shrug, for sufferance is the badge of all our tribe. You call me misbeliever, cut-throat dog, and spat upon my Jewish gabardine. Well, then it now appears you need my help. Shylock, we would have moneys, you say so. What should I say to you? Should I not say, hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? Or shall I bend low and in a bondsman's key say this, there, sir, you spat on me on Wednesday last. Another time you called me dog, and for these courtesies I'll lend you thus much moneys. I am as like to call thee so again, said Antonio contemptuously. For the Jew's long-drawn-out complainings had seemed to the upright merchant, whose affairs were open to the world, no better than the needless whining of a cur. Angrily, for he could see that his young friend was worried, he went on to demand a plain answer. Would the Jew, or would he not, lend the money? If the money was to be lent, then let it be done according to a bond. If the bond was broken, then the penalty must be exacted. Antonio desired no favours from the Jew. "Why, look how you storm!" cried Shylock, shrinking before the merchant's anger as before a taskmaster's whip. "I would be friends with you," he pleaded, and then, to prove his good faith, offered to lend the money and demand not a jot of interest. "This were kindness," cried Bassanio, as the prospect of going to Belmont with servants in attendance and fine clothes on his back seemed within his grasp. Shylock, now friends with everybody, though none was friends with him, nodded and rubbed his skinny hands. They must go at once to a notary and draw up the bond. Though there was to be no interest, it was proper that there should be a bond, to be exacted only if the money lent was not repaid. And what should that bond be? Not property, not furnishings, not jewels, but— Here the Jew laughed merrily, and the high-pitched sound made the barred windows seem to look sharply down. But a pound of the merchant's living flesh. And why not? Was not money flesh and life to the Jew? Why not then to the merchant? Shylock smiled at the humour of it with all the openness at his command, but smiles and snarls were kissing cousins to his lips. Antonio stared. Then he shrugged his shoulders and smiled. The Jew's humour was as strange as the Jew. He was content to seal a bargain which seemed to him far-fetched in the extreme. "You shall not seal to such a bond for me," muttered Bassanio, suddenly uneasy for his friend. But Antonio brushed aside his friend's concern. His ships and his money would all be home again a month before the bond was due. Shylock also was eager to quiet Bassanio's fears. "If he should break his day, what should I gain by exaction of the forfeiture?" he demanded. "A pound of man's flesh taken from a man is not so estimable profitable neither as flesh of muttons, beefs, or goats." No, it was only to oblige Antonio and be his friend that he had proposed so unthrifty a bond. The merchant believed him. And why not? What manner of man could really desire flesh instead of ducats? "Hie thee, gentle Jew," he laughed, as Shylock scuttled away to gather in the ducats. "The Hebrew will turn Christian, he grows kind." But Bassanio shook his head. "I like not fair terms and a villain's mind." Antonio smiled, and once more brushed aside his young friend's fears and forebodings. Now Shylock had a daughter called Jessica, and she was as lovely as the night in spring. Her mother must have been most wondrous for the daughter to have come by so much beauty, though mixed with Shylock's blood. She longed with all her heart to fly from the Jew's dark house, not to freedom, but to the prettier prison of love. She loved Lorenzo, Bassanio's friend, and he loved her, though all that had passed between them had been sighs from a window and sighs from the street. Nor was she alone in longing to escape from Shylock. The Jew had a servant by name of Lancelot Gobbo, who likewise pined. He was a lively youth, and could no longer endure the miserly life of locks and bolts, and keys and strong-boxes, and rooms that never saw the light of day. He was the first to fly away. He took his chance when it came, which was when Bassanio called to leave a letter, bidding the Jew come to supper with Antonio. Lancelot begged to be taken into Bassanio's service, which Bassanio gladly did, for he had need of a servant now that he was to go to Belmont and try his fortune with the lady there. Gratiano, that idle talker, strolling by, took it into his head, where there was room enough and to spare, to ask if he too might go to Belmont with Bassanio. Bassanio sighed. It was hard to refuse a friend, but harder still to oblige such a one. He pleaded that, if Gratiano came, he would behave with proper modesty, for the fair lady of Belmont would surely not look kindly on a suitor who came with a chattering idiot in his train. Sweet Jessica was as miserable as a widowed jackdaw when Lancelot told her of his good luck. She grieved that her father's hated house would now be robbed of its only cheerfulness. "But fare thee well," she wished him. "There is a ducat for thee." She gave him the gold, and in addition, with much secrecy, gave him a letter for his new master's friend, the handsome Lorenzo. When Lancelot had gone, she sighed most bitterly. for she was ashamed that she was her father's child. "Oh, Lorenzo," she whispered, "if thou keep promise, I shall end this strife, become a Christian and thy loving wife." Young Lancelot, who loved and pitied his old master's daughter with all his heart, delivered the letter as swiftly as he could. Eagerly Lorenzo read it. His eyes shone, his heart soared. The letter was such a letter as lovers dream of. His Jessica was waiting for him. She had gathered together a dowry of gold and jewels, and was waiting for him to come and take her from her father's house. It was a night of carnival. Flutes and songs and drums enriched the warm air. Slow gondolas, heavy with lovers, like baskets crammed with grapes, drifted between the mansions, looped and necklaced with little lights. Strange, fantastic figures, led by torch-bearers, danced and capered along the water streets, and mocked at their mirror images as they kept rippled pace. Masks and laughter were the order of the night, save in one dark street and in one dark house, where the Jew Shylock lived. The door opened, and Shylock came out. His eyes glittered angrily as he heard the sounds of distant music and light laughter. He called for his daughter, and she came, gleaming softly like a candle. "I am bid forth to supper, Jessica," he said. "There are my keys." She took the heavy ring, which with its dull iron garnishings hung on her white arm like a manacle on a moonbeam. "Jessica, my girl," said the father, caught by a sudden dread, "look to my house. I am right loath to go, for there is some ill a-brewing towards my rest, for I did dream of money-bags tonight." He shivered in his long black gown. Then a louder burst of music made him angry again. "Lock up my doors," he commanded, as sounds of singing and dancing feet drew near. "Clamber not you up to the casements then, nor thrust your head into the public street to gaze on Christian fools with varnished faces." He shook his head. "I have no mind of feasting forth tonight, but I will go." Breathing deeply with relief, Jessica watched her father go, his dark shape putting out the distant lights like a cloud among stars. Then she went back within doors. Presently 2 friends of Lorenzo came by. They paused, looked up at the house, and nodded. This was the place where they were to meet. They waited, murmuring mockingly of lovers being late. Then Lorenzo came. All 3 wore painted masks with painted smiles that hid more smiles, so that one might have wondered which were faces, which were masks. Lorenzo gazed up towards a casement that was stoutly shuttered. He called softly, "Ho! Who's within?" The shutters opened, and a light shone out, and in that light was Jessica, pretty Jessica, anxiously disguised in costume of a boy. She looked down, saw the painted smiler looking up. "Who are you?" "Lorenzo, and thy love." She laughed for joy, and then, bidding him catch, cast down like a bright tear from her father's house a casket of jewels and gold. Then she vanished from the window to lock the doors and fill her purse and boy's pockets with all the ducats she could carry away. So she left her father's scowls for love's smiles, and her father's darkness for love's light, taking with her his treasure and herself, who was the dearest treasure of all. That very night, in a close and secret gondola, Lorenzo and Jessica fled from the city in Shylock's wrath. At the same time, or very near it, Bassanio, with his friend Gratiano, and attended by Lancelot Gobbo, his new servant, embarked for Belmont and its lady. He carried with him the love and fond hopes of Antonio the merchant, who, for Bassanio's sake, had pledged his very life to the Jew. Even as the casket that Jessica had thrown down from Shylock's window had contained her father's treasure, so one of the 3 closed caskets in Belmont contained another father's treasure. Not gold, not jewels, but his daughter herself. In one of them was locked fair Portia's likeness, and he who chose it would gain her hand and heart. But in which casket? The gold, the silver, or the lead? That was the question. To choose right meant happiness beyond measure. To choose wrong meant, by the harsh condition imposed on the chooser, to go forever without a wife. Soft lutes played delicate airs in the silken chamber where the caskets were, for a new suitor had come to Belmont to try for the lady. The Prince of Morocco, a turbaned Moor whose dark face sprang from his rich attire like ebony from snow. That he loved fair Portia was not to be doubted, for he was willing to risk all on the chance of winning her. While Portia and her maids looked uncertainly on, wondering where he would choose, he studied the 3 caskets, each in turn, as if his fierce eyes would probe the metal and spy the treasure within. "This first of gold," murmured the dark prince, "who this inscription bears, 'Who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire.' The second silver, which this promise carries, 'Who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves.' This third, dull lead, with warning all as blunt, 'Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath.'" He shook his head. "The one of them contains my picture, Prince," said Portia softly. "If you choose that, then I am yours withal." He flashed upon her a smile like dark fruit sliced, then returned to his contemplation of the caskets. "Not lead, never lead." "Is't like that lead contains her?" he wondered. "'Twere damnation to think so base a thought." "But what of silver?" "Oh, sinful thought!" he exclaimed. "Never so rich a gem was set in worse than gold." He picked up the golden casket. "Deliver me the key," he demanded, his deep voice shaking with expectation. "Here do I choose." "There, take it, Prince," said Portia quietly. "And if my form lies there, then I am yours." He took the key and unlocked the casket. He looked within. A grey pallor overwashed his dark complexion. Not fair Portia, but a death's head glared up at him. He had lost all. He took his sad departure with dignity and some nobility. "A gentle riddance," breathed Portia, much relieved, for though she had admired the prince, she had not loved him. "Draw the curtains. Go." In Venice, in busy, moneyed Venice, all was confusion. The Jew had discovered the loss of his daughter and the loss of his gold. He was mad with dismay, not knowing which loss had plunged the sharper dagger in his heart. "I never heard a passion so confused," marvelled a friend of Antonio's to another, "as the dog Jew did utter in the streets, 'My daughter, oh my ducats, oh my daughter, fled with a Christian, oh my Christian ducats, justice, the law.'" As the other listened to the tale of the Jew's wild distraction, he shook his head gravely. "Let good Antonio look he keep his day," he murmured, "or he shall pay for this." Upon which his companion remembered, as people often do when there's a chance of disaster for others, that he'd heard a rumour that one of Antonio's ships had been wrecked. The 2 gentlemen stared at one another, and then with words, if not with hearts, expressed their deep concern for what might befall their friend Antonio if he failed to keep his bond. In Belmont, where the concerns of Venice were as distant as the moon, another suitor had come to try for Portia's hand. A Spanish gentleman, gorgeous in velvet and with a hand and wrist as proud as a swan's neck. The Prince of Aragon, no less. While Portia and Nerissa and the bowing servants of the prince looked on, the nobleman himself surveyed the caskets and the prize. Modestly Portia lowered her eyes and hid a smile. The leaden basket detained him not an instant, so princely a hand was never formed to touch so base a metal. Gold he toyed with, then put it by, for the good reason that it promised what many men desire. "I will not choose what many men desire," he said with a curl of his lip and a wave of his hand, "because I will not jump with common spirits, and rank me with the barbarous multitudes." The servants bowed and murmured admiringly, while Portia and Nerissa cast their eyes to heaven. So to the silver casket he turned. "Who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves." He smiled knowingly, and his servants nodded at their master's sagacity. What could such a prince as he deserve but the very best? "Give me the key for this," he commanded, with a snap of his fingers and a waiting hand, "and instantly unlock my fortunes here." The casket was opened, and the prince looked within. He was silent. At such a moment the Moor's complexion had turned to grey. This prince's colour darkened to red, and all his servants trembled. "What's here?" he demanded at length. "The portrait of a blinking idiot?" Anger gave way to grief. "Did I deserve no more than a fool's head?" he asked of the lady, who most unkindly smiled. "That my price?" "To offend and judge are distinct offices," said Portia, a little sorry for the downcast prince, "and of opposed natures." He sighed heavily. But before he took his departure, he mustered up his spirits sufficiently to admit, "With one fool's head I came to woo, but I go away with two." When the prince and all his servants had departed, there came news that yet another suitor was approaching. His messenger, a young Venetian, was already at the gate. Portia and Nerissa looked at one another. Who could this messenger's master be? "Bassanio," prayed Nerissa. "Lord love, if thy will it be." The water ran choppily by the Rialto, as an invisible wind like strong rumour sent it scurrying. Two good friends of Antonio talked solemnly amid the bustle and business of brokers and merchants. Again they'd heard tales that one of Antonio's ships had been wrecked and all its cargo lost. They shook their heads sadly over their friend's ill luck, and prayed there would be no more of it. "How now, Shylock?" exclaimed one as the Jew drew near. "What news among the merchants?" The Jew, his eyes all red from weeping, glared at the Christian gentleman, in whose contemptuous smiles he read all too easily mockery for his loss. His daughter was gone, and they laughed at him. Such a daughter, they jeered, was too good for such a father to keep. "But tell us," they asked, brushing aside the Jew's misfortunes, "do you hear whether Antonio have had any loss at sea or no?" Another knife in his heart, for Antonio was in distress and near to being bankrupt. More ducats thrown to the dogs. "Let him look to his bond," snarled Shylock. "Let him look to his bond." "Why?" cried one of the gentlemen in some surprise. "I am sure if he forfeit thou wilt not take his flesh. What's that good for?" "To bait fish withal," screamed the Jew, beside himself with grief and rage. "If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge." The two gentlemen stepped back. Passers-by paused. Velvet lords and ladies turned, stared, exchanged glances of scorn, but discreetly, for none wanted to be noticed and publicly pounced upon by the inflamed Jew. As the black-gowned Shylock raved on, "He hath disgraced me, and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies, and what's his reason? I am a Jew." Here the moneylender glared about him with such ferocious distress and such ancient anguish that the brightly hovering world of Venice seemed to shrink and tremble like butterflies' wings at the cooling of summer. Shylock went on, his voice as raw as the shrieking of sea-birds. "Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt by the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction." Shylock stopped, panting from his exertions. To the relief of Antonio's friends, a messenger came, bidding them come to the merchant's house. The lookers-on shrugged their shoulders and strolled away. Shylock stood alone until another of his tribe, one Tubal, joined him. "What news from Genoa?" demanded Shylock. "Hast thou found my daughter?" The news was bad. Tubal had heard of her but not seen her. Shylock was plunged into the blackest misery. All his riches gone, would that his daughter was dead. "The curse never fell upon our nation till now," he groaned. "I never felt it till now." But on the other hand, there was news in Genoa that one of Antonio's ships had been cast away. That was better. Yet then again, Tubal had heard in talkative Genoa that Shylock's daughter had spent at one sitting 80 ducats. "Thou stick'st a dagger in me," moaned Shylock. But, said Tubal, Antonio's creditors were gathering, and the Jew was pacified, until he heard that one of them had had a ring of Jessica for a monkey. "Out upon her!" wept Shylock, wringing his hands and tearing at the shiny ringlets of his hair. "It was my turquoise. I had it of Lear when I was a bachelor. I would not have given it for a wilderness of monkeys." But thank God, Antonio was ruined, and Shylock sent Tubal for an officer to enforce his terrible claim upon the proud merchant who had spurned him. In Belmont, in smiling Belmont, the new suitor had appeared, and to Portia's joy and fear, he was that very Bassanio she remembered from long ago. To her joy because her heart danced to see him, and to her fear because, if he failed in his choice of casket, she would never see him more. In vain she begged him put off the fateful choice, and take pleasure in her house and gardens, and the soft air of Belmont, which was always filled with music. But Bassanio, having come thus far and at such a cost, could not endure to delay. So now he stood before the caskets, with Gratiano, strangely quiet Gratiano, by his side, and the fair lady of Belmont, with all her maids like pale daisies bending towards her warmth and light, watched him intently. Softly, though in a voice that trembled, Portia bade a page-boy, who sat cross-legged and fondled a lute almost as large as himself, to sing. The child frowned down at his instrument, and gravely began. "Tell me where is fancy bred, or in the heart, or in the head." Some say it was the song that guided Bassanio in his choice, for Portia already loved him well enough to give his fortune a proper turn, but she was ever honourable in her dealings, and well Bassanio knew it. No, if he was guided at all, it was not by rhyme, but by the bright sudden looks of Portia's sea-blue eyes, which warned him that true beauty dwells within. It was his own love and hers that taught him the wisdom to know where his best hope lay. not in gold, not in silver, but in quiet, unassuming lead. "And here choose I," he breathed. "Joy be the consequence." And so it was. Within the leaden casket was fair Portia's portrait. Bassanio had won the lady of his heart. The joy of the chosen was no less than the joy of the chooser. They were a pair fairly matched. To solemnize their promised marriage, Portia gave Bassanio a ring, and made him swear that he would never, so long as he loved her, part with it. Such a ring Lear had given to Shylock, and Jessica had stolen it away. Willingly Bassanio promised, and then Gratiano spoke up. He too had found a bride, whose promise had depended on the choice of casket. She was Portia's maid, Nerissa, whose loveliness was only exceeded by her mistresses as the lily by the rose. It would seem that, by holding his tongue in accordance with his promise, Gratiano had made a better conquest by silence than by talk. Then, in the midst of this high summer of happiness, a cloud came over the sun. There arrived from Venice Lorenzo and Jessica, and a friend of Antonio's. They brought a letter from the merchant to his young friend. "Sweet Bassanio," wrote the merchant, in the extremity of his distress, "my ships have all miscarried, my creditors grow cruel, my estate is very low, my bond to the Jew is forfeit, and since in paying it is impossible I should all live, debts are cleared between you and I, if I might but see you at my death. Notwithstanding, use your pleasure. If your love do not persuade you to come, let not my letter." Belmont was fallen into dullness. The house was quiet, and the gardens emptied. Lutes and guitars were coffined in their cases, for the two new brides had been widowed by the need of a friend. Their husbands, Bassanio and Gratiano, had hastened to Venice to try to save the good Antonio, but there was little hope. Even though Portia had urged Bassanio to offer the Jew many times the value of the bond, it was feared he would not take it. His daughter Jessica declared that she had heard her father swear that there was no money that could buy back the bond. His love of ducats had been quite swallowed up in his desire for revenge. He would have his pound of flesh. He knew full well that not even the Duke could deny him this, for the bond had been drawn up in accordance with the law of Venice, and to skirt that law would be to undermine it, and so undermine the chief strength of the state. Portia thought deeply about these matters, and wondered how she might help her husband's friend with her wit if her wealth proved to be of no avail. It was a matter of law, and though no lawyer herself, she had a cousin in Padua by name of Dr. Bellario, who was most learned in the science. To Bellario, then, she sent her servant with a letter requiring certain notes and articles of clothing to be dispatched to the Venice ferry, where she and her maid would receive them. Then, confiding to Lorenzo and Jessica the charge of her house, she gave out that she and Nerissa were retiring to a monastery while their husbands were away. This done, she and Nerissa left Belmont on their strange adventure. "Come on, Nerissa," she murmured with brightly gleaming eyes. "I have work in hand that you yet know not of. We'll see our husbands before they think of us." The waters of Venice ran dark and deep beside the Hall of Justice, reflecting stone walls and no more than a knife of the sky. Within, among gilded pillars and richly tapestried walls, from which long-dead lawgivers gazed faintly down, there was much murmuring as the Duke and all the dignitaries of the state entered to hear the cause and give judgment. They sat, with a sigh of crimson velvets and a quiet chiming of their chains of gold. Antonio was summoned and duly fetched. Poor man! His face was already as pale as death. He saw Bassanio among the onlookers, and seemed to gain a little courage from the presence of his young friend. "Go one and call the Jew into the court," commanded the Duke. Shylock was called, and Shylock came. In Sabbath gown as black as night, he stood before the court, rubbing and rubbing his thin white hands, as the Duke urged him to be merciful and not demand the terrible payment of the bond. Shylock shook his head, and his oiled locks gleamed redly in the crowding candlelight, as if his bloody thoughts had stained them. He would have his bond. He stared defiantly at the assembled lords in all their pride. "If you deny it," he warned, "let the danger light upon your charter and your city's freedom." Impulsively, Bassanio stepped forward and pleaded with the Jew. Shylock answered him coldly, curtly, and scarce deigning to look at him. Antonio interposed and begged Bassanio not waste his breath. "Make no more offers," he pleaded, weary with distress. "Let me have judgment and the Jew his will." "For thy 3,000 ducats here is 6," cried Bassanio, throwing down a heavy purse onto the table of judgment. Again Shylock shook his head. He would have nothing but his bond. "How shalt thou hope for mercy, rendering none?" wondered the Duke, shocked beyond measure by the force of the Jew's hatred. "What judgment shall I dread doing no wrong?" demanded Shylock, angry with this Christian court that sought to escape its own laws. "If you deny me," he cried, "fie upon your law. There is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer, shall I have it?" The Duke and his lords gravely conferred. There was no doubt that the Jew had law upon his side. If only the learned Dr. Bellario, for whom the Duke had sent, would come and unperplex the court. Then, even as that doctor's name was spoken, it was learned that he had sent a messenger with letters. "Bring us the letters!" exclaimed the Duke. "Call the messenger!" The messenger was called, and the messenger came. A most curious small clerk, in clerk's gown and clerk's hat, with clerk's wig and clerk's spectacles, so that nothing showed but what was proper to a clerk, who did not look like Nerissa at all. In a voice that struggled to keep low, but kept rising like a swimmer for air, the clerk presented the Duke with Dr. Bellario's greetings and his letters. As the Duke read the letters, the court buzzed with expectation, then sharply drew in its breath as it was seen that Shylock, merciless Shylock, had taken out his knife and was steadily sharpening it against the sole of his shoe. Dr. Bellario's letters told that he was sick and unable to attend, but that in his place he had sent a young lawyer in whom he had the greatest faith. The Duke looked up, and there before him stood the young lawyer, a most curious, small young lawyer, in lawyer's gown and lawyer's hat, with lawyer's wig and lawyer's thick spectacles, so that nothing showed but what was proper to a lawyer, who did not look like fair Portia at all. The Duke looked doubtfully at the little advocate, whose chin, nestling in lawyer's bands, was as beardless as silk. Was the young lawyer acquainted with the cause before the court? The young lawyer was, and the young lawyer's voice was not unlike the clerk's, being low in parts. The Duke shrugged his shoulders, and with a wave of his many-ringed hand, indicated that the trial between the Jew and the merchant of Venice should proceed. "Of a strange nature is the suit you follow," said the lawyer to the Jew, "yet in such rule that the Venetian law cannot impugn you as you do proceed." The Jew's beard revealed, rather than hid, the grimness of his smile. "Do you confess the bond?" asked the lawyer of the merchant. Helplessly the merchant confessed it. "Then must the Jew be merciful," decided the lawyer. "On what compulsion must I?" demanded the Jew. "Tell me that." The court murmured. What compulsion could this small lawyer bring upon the dark, threatening Jew to make him merciful? The lawyer faced the Jew, took a pace towards him, held out hands in a gesture of pleading, hands that were whiter and gentler than lawyers' hands ever were, and spoke to him. "The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth, as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives, and him that takes. It is mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown." Thus the lawyer pleaded with Shylock to temper justice with mercy. But Shylock, savage Shylock, would have nothing of it. He demanded his pound of the merchant's flesh. "Is he not able to discharge the money?" inquired the lawyer of the court. "Yes, here I tender it for him in the court," cried Bassanio, and offered twice the sum, or even 10 times, upon which the small lawyer looked sharply at the young man who was so prodigal with ducats, to redeem the bond. "If that will not suffice," went on Bassanio, "it must appear that malice bears down truth. Rest once the law to your authority. To do a great right, do a little wrong, and curb this cruel devil of his will." "It must not be," said the lawyer. "There is no power in Venice can alter a decree established. 'Twill be recorded for a precedent." "A Daniel come to judgment, yea, a Daniel!" cried Shylock, capering with delight to find the justice of his cause upheld. "O wise young judge, how I do honour thee!" The small lawyer nodded, and asked to see the bond. It was given, and when read, proved to be as the Jew had said. "Take thrice thy money, bid me tear the bond," urged the lawyer. But Shylock would not relent. He stood by the law, and the law upheld him. Antonio must pay the forfeit, a pound of his living flesh, to be cut nearest his heart. "The law allows it, and the court awards it," decreed the lawyer. So Antonio, condemned Antonio, took his last farewell of Bassanio, and prepared himself for Shylock's upraised knife. The court leaned forward, pale with dread of what the law could do. "Tarry a little," said the lawyer suddenly, even as the knife was at Antonio's breast. "There is something else. This bond doth give thee here no jot of blood. The words expressly are, a pound of flesh. Take then thy bond, take thou thy pound of flesh, but in cutting it, if thou dost shed one drop of Christian blood, thy lands and goods are, by the laws of Venice, confiscate unto the state of Venice." The knife faltered. The hand that held it shook and trembled, and a dreadful bitterness curdled the Jew's fierce face. The very law he had invoked had defeated him. The mocking laughter of the court rang in his ears like the worst of Sunday's bells. He put away his knife. He rubbed and rubbed his hands, and muttered that he would take the offer of thrice the bond. "Here is the money," cried Bassanio gladly. But the small lawyer would not allow it, and with a look of mingled affection and reproof at the extravagant young man, pressed Shylock still harder with the weight of the law. He was to have only what he had demanded, neither less nor more. Not even his principal was to be restored, only the pound of flesh without one drop of blood. He staggered, stared about him, saw only a sea of Christian faces and a sea of Christian smiles. He longed only to be gone. But even this was denied him. He, an alien, had undoubtedly sought the life of a citizen, therefore all his wealth was to be taken, half for the merchant, half for the state. His life itself was now in the hand of the Duke. "Down, therefore," cried the lawyer, who had once urged him to show mercy, "and beg mercy of the Duke." "That thou shalt see the difference of our spirit," pronounced the Duke, "I pardon thee thy life before thou ask it." Shylock shook his head. He smiled bitterly. Of what use was his life now? "Take my life, and all," he whispered. "Pardon not that. You take my house, when you do take the prop that doth sustain my house. You take my life, when you do take the means whereby I live." The small lawyer, who had perhaps been carried away by the ingeniousness of argument, was struck by the Jew's tragic words and remembered. He turned to the merchant and asked, "What mercy can you render him, Antonio?" Antonio proved no less merciful than the Duke. Half of Shylock's wealth should be restored, if he would, at his death, leave it to his daughter and her husband. The other half Antonio himself would use, and likewise bequeath to Jessica and Lorenzo. All this should be allowed upon one condition, that the Jew should turn Christian. "Art thou contented, Jew?" asked the lawyer, with the most gentle regard. "What dost thou say?" "I am content," muttered the Jew, and with bowed head left the court to embrace a gentler God than the one that had brought him. As he went, the thronged candles tugged after him, as if to lend him a little of the radiance of a court in which not justice, not the law, but mercy had triumphed. When all were dispersed and the Duke departed, Bassanio embraced his saved friend, and together they thanked the small lawyer whose wit and skill had so marvellously succeeded. What gift could they give him? At first the lawyer would take nothing, but then, when pressed, asked no more than Bassanio's ring. Alas, it was the very ring that Portia had given him, and which he had sworn to keep so long as he should live. He made excuses, said it was not good enough, and offered instead to find the dearest ring in all Venice. But the lawyer would take nothing else, and so took nothing. Together with his small clerk he left the court, making scornful comment upon those who offer and then turn niggardly when put to the performance. "My lord Bassanio," urged Antonio, "let him have the ring." Bassanio sighed. He took the ring from his finger and sent Gratiano with it to overtake the small lawyer and his small clerk. So Bassanio parted with Portia's ring, and at the same time Gratiano parted with Nerissa's, for she too had given her husband a ring in love's pledge, which ring the lawyer's small clerk had begged. The moon was high in Belmont, and the dark gardens flowed with silver, like a Venice built in dreams. "In such a night," sighed Lorenzo, as he strolled entwined with Jessica, and gave an instance of lovers long ago. "In such a night," sighed Jessica, and gave another no less apt. "In such a night," proposed Lorenzo, and so they continued, night for night, until they were distracted by music that heralded the return of Portia and Nerissa, who were followed soon after by Bassanio and Gratiano, with the saved merchant Antonio, newly come from Venice. Lutes, guitars, and viols, sweet as honey, swelled the tender meeting of wives and husbands, until a discord broke up the harmony. This discord concerned the giving of a ring. Gratiano, so it seemed, had given Nerissa's ring to a lawyer's clerk in Venice. Nerissa was outraged, and so was fair Portia when she learned that her husband, the ardent Bassanio, had given her ring to the lawyer. So much for love, so much for promises, so much for husbands' vows breathed in the first heat of passion. Antonio, much dismayed by the distress his own distress had brought about, sought to intercede. Portia sighed and relented. "Give him this," she sighed, "and bid him keep it better than the other." She gave the merchant a ring which he, in turn, gave to the apologizing Bassanio. He took it, he glanced at it, he stared. It was the very ring he had given to the lawyer. Likewise, and at the same time, Gratiano was given the very ring he had bestowed upon the clerk. At once, base suspicions entered the minds of the husbands of how their wives might have come by the rings. But soon all was told, of how Portia had been the lawyer and Nerissa the clerk. So all ended in music, smiles, and happiness. And fair Portia, practicing the mercy she had preached, embraced her husband with all her heart.
Shakespeare Today by Dr. Rex Gibson. Shakespeare is alive today. Although William Shakespeare the man lies long buried in Stratford-upon-Avon parish church, he lives on in countless millions of hearts and minds. Imagine that cold April day in 1616. The small funeral procession labours slowly along Church Street. Huge black horses draw the wooden cart bearing the simple coffin. On the coffin, a few daffodils and primroses, plucked only minutes before from the garden of New Place, gravely nod with each jolt and jar of the rutted road. Most of Stratford's citizens have turned out, muffled against the biting wind, to see the last appearance of their wealthy neighbour. You couldn't call it a crowd, just small respectful groups clustering the dry places on the roadside, careful to avoid the mud splashed up by the great hooves of the lumbering horses. Men and women briefly bow their heads as the dead man and the black-clad mourners pass. The townspeople share their opinions, as neighbours do. He used to do some acting, didn't he? Made a lot of money in London, writing plays, I think. He used to come home once a year to see his family, but nobody here really knew a lot about Master Shakespeare. Wasn't he a poet? Big landowner hereabouts, anyway. All those fields over at Welcome. Past the Guild Chapel, where he had worshipped as a boy, past the school where long ago his imagination was fired by language. At the churchyard gate, under the sad elms, 6 men effortlessly heave the coffin onto their shoulders. William Shakespeare is about to enter his parish church for the last time. Nobody at that long-ago funeral guessed that they were saying goodbye to a man who would become the most famous Englishman of his age, perhaps of all time. Shakespeare lives on. He weaves familiar themes into his tales, the conflicts between parents and children, love at first sight, the power struggles of war and politics. His language is heard everywhere. If you ever call someone a blinking idiot, or a tower of strength, or describe them as tongue-tied, or suffering from green-eyed jealousy, or being dead as a doornail, you are speaking the language of Shakespeare. If you say, "Oh, it was Greek to me," or "parting is such sweet sorrow," or that something is too much of a good thing, and that you have not slept one wink, the words of Shakespeare are alive in your mouth. Shakespeare's language has a power all of its own, rich in emotional intensity. Because he was a poet who wrote plays, he could make even the simplest words utterly memorable. All around the world people know Hamlet's line, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Shakespeare is still performed today because of the electrifying power of his storytelling. Whether his story is about love or murder or kings and queens, he keeps you on the edge of your seat wanting to know what happens next. He created well over 900 characters in his plays. However large or small the part, each character springs vividly to life in performance. They live in our imagination because they are so much like people today. They experience the same emotions that everyone feels and recognizes: love, jealousy, fear, courage, ambition, pride, and 100 others. In every play, Shakespeare invites us to imagine what the characters are like. And for nearly 400 years, people have accepted Shakespeare's invitation. The plays have been reimagined in very many ways. They have been shortened, added to, and set in very different periods of history. They have been translated into many languages and performed all over the world. Shakespeare lives because all persons in every age and every society can make their own interpretations and performances of Shakespeare. You too can make your own living Shakespeare. Try reading the play either by yourself, changing your voice to suit the different characters, or with friends, and record it on a tape recorder. If you have a toy theatre, try staging it with characters and scenery that you make and paint yourself. Or collect together a cast and create your own production for your family and friends.